This probably isn't going to surprise anyone, but I'm a big fan of horror movies. I think it might have come through in some of my crafts before. So, obviously, Evil Dead, iconic, that cabin, equally iconic, and I decided to build it. I do apologize, this is going to be kind of a weird video. Despite being one of the most ambitious things I've built, maybe second only to the Wizard's Tower, I actually did most of this like 6 months before I decided to start a YouTube channel, so I did not film most of it. Great planning on my part, I know. Even though the cabin was mostly built, it wasn't completely done, so now that I decided to finally finish it up, I was able to film a few things, but mostly I will just talk about the process and what I did kind of quickly, obviously, because I don't have footage. And then I'll show some clips of what I was able to film. The first thing I did before actually building it was figure out the floor plan. Fortunately, I was able to find a few pictures and resources that map out the layout of the cabin. They're all slightly different, which was kind of annoying, but also good because of the differences. I had a little freedom in playing around with the layout. I'll link those in the comments below. I did also find a really good video I will also link, but I didn't see it until after I built it, and like watching it, I'm like, oh, there's a few things I missed that could have been more accurate, but whatever. So the project started with a large piece of MDF. I think it was actually taken from the back of a picture frame that broke. It's like twice as thick as chipboard and pretty sturdy, so I thought it would make a good base. The walls are all chipboard. Well, the interior walls. On the outside, I debated doing something like stir sticks or popsicle sticks for the logs or the wood planks, but to be completely honest, that sounded tedious and terrible, so I decided to actually go with foam board, and I carved the lines of the logs. And then with a brush, like a stiff bristled brush, I brushed the wood grain into the foam. And I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. I decided pretty early on I wanted the cabin to have a removable roof so I could use it both as external and internal terrain. The roof was pretty simple. The frame of the roof was also chipboard, and for the texture on the roof, some people have done corrugated metal. Looking at pictures, it's not quite corrugated iron. It's sort of like this flat material with like ribbing spaced out across it. I don't know much about construction or houses or any of that, so I don't know what it's called. But to imitate that, I glued on strips of coffee stir sticks, which was tedious and annoying, but not as tedious and annoying as covering the entire house in them. Once I had the walls and the frame done, I basically went room by room and sort of just built everything based on what was easiest. So for a lot of the like furniture, I did a lot of 3D printing, the bed, the couch, the piano, the desk, the toilet, furniture in the kitchen. But a lot of the shelves, I did just pieces of chipboard because it was, the right sort of dimensions. Same thing for books, just cut up thin strips of chipboard. I'm pretty sure I've talked about that in an older video. I used some dried out wipes for fabric, both for the rugs on the floor and also all the curtains. And the curtains I tied with a very small string. I did also look at a lot of screenshots from the film to, figure out how the cabin is decorated. So I did my best to sort of match things, at least in general placement and sort of function of things, if not exactly the same. Some of my favorite little touches. On the floor in the living room, I carved the door to the basement and I glued some chain down so it looks like the door is chained up as it is in the film. I used a piece of tin foil, I believe, as a mirror. I've got the tape recorder on the desk that is reading from the Necronomicon and summons the deadites in the first place. I 3D printed 3 different animal heads, and I glued magnets to them, and I glued a magnet to the wall. This way I can have the normal deer head, the possessed deer head, or the wolf head from Cabin in the Woods, because I didn't want to make both cabins, but I definitely wanted to throw in some references so it could sort of, squint and pretend it's that cabin. So for example, I've got the conch shell in the kitchen. I've got a puzzle box on the desk in the piano room, which is both a reference to Hellraiser and the Hellraiser sort of parody in Cabin in the Woods. And in that same room, I put the painting from Cabin in the Woods, the creepy hunter painting that covers up the two-way mirror. Also for the floor, I did the same thing as I did for the walls. I drew in all the floorboards because, once again, I did not want to glue down individual boards. That sounds like a nightmare. But then once that was done, I painted all the walls and floors, and then painted all of the furniture separately before gluing it in place. Now for the parts that I got on film. Basically, the last thing I had to do was weathering. And I tried something that I've really wanted to try for a long time, but had never really gotten around to, and that was making my own weathering powders. I bought a pack of chalk pastels, and I don't know if there's a specific kind that works better than others. I just ordered, a random color selection off Amazon, and I put each chalk in a little baggie and I smashed them all to bits, and it was very satisfying. I highly recommend. I mainly used gray to make the wood look more worn. In other cases, this is something I might do with like a gray dry brush. But I thought, since the walls were carved out of foam and they didn't stick out a ton, I was afraid the dry brush would actually cover too much of it. So I decided to do this instead, and I'm actually really happy with it because compared to the actual made for weathering powders I have, those are very dark, whereas these, they color it, but it's very subtle. It's either not as colorful or it doesn't stick as well. Whatever the reason is, you need a lot more to get the same effect, which works really well for me because I usually end up putting too much weathering powder on. So this way I can build it up and actually get to an amount that I'm happy with. After the gray, I also did a light green to sort of represent like moss and like stains from plants growing on the building. In a lot of pictures, it's not very colorful. It almost feels like winter, like the vines on the house are dead, but I wanted to put a little color into it anyway. Another thing I tried for the first time, and I did not film this, so awesome, but I used birch seed pods as leaves. I'll throw up a picture on screen, but when you take the pods apart, they break apart into these really tiny little things. And I mean, you can look at the video and judge for yourself, but I think they look amazing. I've used a leaf punch before, and that's good, but these feel a lot less artificial. There's a lot more texture to it and some like more natural color variation, and I'm just really happy with it. But once those were glued on, I came back with a mixture of half water and half PVA glue, and I put it on all the leaves so they would stick better. It's the same thing I would normally do with flocking, just because it's likely to flake off, and I wanted the leaves to stay on, so I glued them. And then the last thing I did was I took this sort of moss mat, I guess, that I got from the Dollar Tree, and you can actually see the sort of mesh wall. I don't even know what to call it. The right side of the screen showing the left side of the porch, that was also taken from this mat thing, whatever it is. It's like a grid with moss weaved into it, so I took the moss off and used the grid. But now I go back to it and I take some of the moss and I use it for the vines that are on the house. I sort of just, take the longest bits I could find and glue them on in a somewhat realistic looking manner. The thing to keep in mind with vines is that they usually grow up towards the sun, so if you're doing something like this, try not to have them like pointing down, because that wouldn't make sense. So the most I do is like sideways. And then the last thing I did off camera, I decided the green was too colorful. Like I was saying before, the actual thing is pretty dull. So I ended up going over with a gray wash to mute the colors a little bit. But yeah, that's the cabin from the Evil Dead. I'm just so happy with how it came out. And if you watched my horror stuff battle report, you will have seen this. I think it makes an awesome piece of terrain for, anything modern or horror themed. It was just a lot of fun. But that's about it. So thank you for watching. As always, thank you so much to our patrons. If you really like what we do and want to support us, you can check out the Patreon links below. And until next time, be creative, be kind, and take care of yourself.